Good evening. It's 6:05 p.m. Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. The 5 minutes grace period to begin our lecture for today's office hours has elapsed. And this is, of course, Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy at Medgar College, City University of New York. Welcome, everyone, to this week's office hours. As you know, between last week and this week, or at least by the end of this week, we would have, between last week and the end of this week, we would have covered thus far in Module 8, International Monetary Relations, which we covered last week, and this week, Global Trade Relations. As we continue in this week and our second of 3 segments in Module 8, we will discuss theories of trade, the evolution of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. Special attention will also be given to regional trade agreements. Of course, your assessment also indicates this, and I sincerely hope that you have been going through your week's reading and the videos that are also recommended for the week. Finally, we will discuss trade regimes and how they affect relations between nations and groups within a country. Trade can be a contentious issue, and this is really how it gets to begin to affect groups within a country, right? So trade can be a contentious issue because interest groups and the broader public view their welfare as being more affected by trade policy than by monetary policy, as an example, or investment, as another example, or financial policy. Thus, business, labor, agricultural, consumer, environmental, and cultural groups try to influence government's trade policies. The forces of globalization also continue to have a major effect on trade relations. So notice how during the pandemic, when most countries were locked down, how the global supply chain was severely interrupted, and how there became blockages in the global supply chain and the ability of nation states to trade with each other. So consider that, and speaking of the pandemic that happened just recently, consider that from 1950 to 1973, world economic output, or GDP, of course, as you know, is gross domestic product, grew at an average annual rate of 5.1%, while trade increased on average by 8.2%. From 1972 to 2007, the figures were 2.9% for GDP, again, gross domestic product, and 5.0% for trade growth. The growing interdependence of states has also made trade relations more vulnerable to economic downturns. Thus, the 2008 global financial crisis precipitated drops in global production and trade, first in the developed economies and then in developing countries. Recall, of course, that in a previous class some weeks ago, I had introduced the phrase and the concept of economic contagion. I think we were discussing why, if country A were to become unable to finance its imports, how that would have a knock-on effect on the countries that it imports those goods and services from. That is, if country A imports certain widgets from country B, and country A no longer has the reserves to finance that export, those import for country B, that it will have a knock-on effect on country B because country B will lose market share, and then the companies that produce those widgets in country B may face overcapacity. And to adjust for that overcapacity, he may have to lay off workers. And if he lays off workers, then it will be less tax revenue for the economy of country B, and there will be less money in circulation, all things being equal, for country B. Additionally, instead of net-net, the workers who might be laid off in this scenario in country B, instead of them paying taxes, they may then need support from the government. So that would be a good class of contagion, where country A's inability to finance its trade creates a contagion that affects country B, when country B has really no role in what created the economic conditions in country A. More recently, my lecture last week included why, in efforts to promote their exports, as you will recall, we had a robust conversation last week on exports. In effort to promote their exports, many countries engage in the competitive undervaluation of their currencies. Recall again that my lecture included the devaluation, the definition and advantages and disadvantages of different methods where countries engage in competitive undervaluation of their currency. Specifically, we touched on three critical ways. The first, of course, is fixed exchange rates, also known as the gold standard, where the valuation of the currency is fixed to a resource that has value, in this case, gold. We also discussed floating exchange rate, where the markets determine the value of the currency. Then we discussed a pegged exchange rate, which incorporates aspects of floating and pegged exchange and fixed exchange rate system. So the pegged exchange rate system incorporates aspects of floating and fixed exchange rate system. And one of the big economies that adopt a pegged regime, as I mentioned last week, is the Republic of China. China pegs its currency to a basket of currencies that includes the euro and the dollar, among other currencies. I think transatlantic alliance countries would argue that China engages in competitive undervaluation, and this gives it a non-market economic advantage in the production of certain goods and services. But we will get to that very shortly. We also discussed how exchange rate regimes can affect the balance of payments of countries. It should be noted, however, that the practice of adopting non-market measures to manipulate currency valuation can raise the possibility of a trade war. Indeed, your reading assignment for this week includes tariffs and counter-tariffs between the US and Chinese governments, especially during the Trump administration. So the Trump administration, of course, argued, and as does the current administration, the Biden administration, that non-market economic policies that the Chinese government adopts unduly gives our industries advantages. And I think I have written on this a little bit on the Georgetown Public Policy Review. So feel free at your leisure to Google and see my writing on Chinese trade competitiveness. It is not a required reading for the class, but just for your information. So, furthermore, note that trade and foreign investments are closely related, and multinational corporations have considerable influence on trade issues. And intra-firm trade within multinational corporations account for about 1/3 of total world trade. That is really profound. If you think about it, that intra-firm trade within multinational corporations account for about 1/3 of total world trade. Those are very huge numbers and speaks to the power of big multinational corporations. So as we continue with this second of the 3 segments in Module 8, so the second of the 3 segments in Module 8, which we began last week, is now we're having it today, which is week 9. We will discuss theories of trade, the evolution of multilateral and bilateral trade arrangements. Special attention will be given to regional trade agreements, as well as finally, we will discuss, we will also discuss trade regimes and how they affect relations between nations and groups within a country. So, in thinking about trade regimes and how they affect relations between nations and groups within a country, I think one of the most stark examples is Brexit. So the separation or the exit of the United Kingdom of Great Britain from the European single market. I should note that the single market, which is what the European Union is a lot more comprehensive than a regional trade agreement. Regional trade agreement speaks to the free movement of goods and services. Single market speaks to singular standards. And once a good or service makes it into one country in the single market, it moves seamlessly within that single market. And there are other structural differences as well. But for the purposes of today's conversation, note that a single market is a lot more comprehensive of an agreement than a free trade area or a regional trade agreement. But the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union single market has created and continue to create social tensions and political tensions within the United Kingdom. And in many cases, by many would argue that it led to the demise of multiple European, UK governments because they were unable to reconcile the agreement between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland that no hard border would exist. Whereas the Republic of Ireland is in the European Union and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And if the United Kingdom pulls out of the European single market, then the border between Northern Ireland and European Union effectively becomes an international border. And that created a lot of political tension. So there are a number of learning objectives for this week, obviously. One of the objectives that we want to focus on is your ability to explain multilateral trade relations during the last 2 centuries. So the trajectory of multilateral trade relations during the last 2 centuries. So in thinking of it, what I would like for you to consider is the longer arc of multilateral trade relations. You might want to go back from the Silk Road to today's Belt and Road Initiative. The Silk Road was obviously a trade route that ran from Asia to the Middle East and to and really encompassed several regions, territories, and what we now think of as countries. The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is the Chinese government's signature trade and investment program. So if you were to look at the arc of multilateral trade relations, you could look at it from the perspective of the Silk Road to today's Belt and Road Initiative, from North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, to today's United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, and of course, USMCA and NAFTA. Well, NAFTA evolved into the USMCA, and that is a regional trade agreement between United States in the middle, Mexico to the south, and Canada to the north. From the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and now we're talking about the regulatory structure of trade and which affects multilateral trade relations. So now we've gone into the Belt and Road Initiative obviously deals with trade and investment. NAFTA and USMCA, which it evolved into, deals with regional trade agreements. And then the rules-based system has evolved from general agreement on tariffs and trade to the birth of the World Trade Organization. And of course, the World Trade Organization built on GATT to include trade in intellectual property and trade in services and protection of international intellectual property rights. And this is all in support of economic development and promoting peaceful relations among nations. So another point that you might want to have a good grasp on by the end of this week is an ability to describe the evolution of international trade organizations, such as the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, with the World Trade Organization and Regional Trade Association. Recall that I just went through examples of regional trade associations, which I gave you is USMCA. So as we discussed in previous lectures, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade evolved into the World Trade Organization to include trade in services and intellectual property protection, while regional trade associations such as USMCA, ASEAN, the European Union, which I denote is a closer integration because it's a single market, is not just a regional trade association. The European Union has forged free trade zones to common markets that create economic interdependencies, and as a result, de-incentivizes conflict. The argument here is that if your economy is dependent on goods and services from a region or country, and that region or country is dependent on you purchasing those goods and services, and thereby that country that sells you those goods and services using the revenue that it derives from selling you the goods and services to finance our budget, as an example, reduces the likelihood of conflict. This is generally true. And all things being equal, it is true. But we also know that it is not absolute. And here is a clear example. So the European Union really depended on long-term gas exports or imports from Russia to stabilize its gas market, and a pipeline, Nord Stream, that supplied gas, natural gas from Soviet Union to Germany, and from there to other markets in the European Union, was about to have a cousin called Nord Stream 2. And that was going to make the European Union even more dependent on natural gas exports from Russia. Part of the calculation was that close economic integration will incentivize or de-incentivize the likelihood of conflict. Of course, Russia, it appears, may have seen its monopoly of the European gas market as leverage that it could use to coerce the European Union from turning the blind eye to its invasion of Ukraine. It hasn't exactly worked out that way, because I think the European Union would argue that the rules that maintaining or honoring the norms and rules of a rules-based international order ultimately is more critical to securing global peace, or more specifically European peace. So this is this is maybe one outlier that shows the limitations of the argument that interdependencies can de-incentivize conflict. So the third point you would have to gain mastery of at the end of this week's assessment is to be able to explain why trade among nations is potentially advantageous to all trading partners. So why is it that trade between nations is advantageous to all trading partners? That is between country A, B, C, or any number of countries that are involved in that trade. The way I would phrase it is that all things being equal, trade among nations is advantageous. And the critical and operative phrase here is all things being equal. Trade among nations is advantageous to all trading partners because leveraging the comparative advantage of each country enhances the efficiency of global supply chains. This allows countries to grow their economy through the sale of goods and services where it has comparative advantage, while still being able to enjoy the goods it imports from trading partner countries with comparative advantages in the imported goods and services. And we are going to get into the phrase comparative advantage. I did mention, I did commit in I think our first week of class that I was going to attempt to draw a direct line between the topics we cover in the class and the realities of our everyday environment. I also committed that I'm going to introduce phrases, technical terms that carry a signal and effect that will signal to your audience that you are indeed a Medgar Evers scholar and that you have subject matter knowledge on global trade and political economy. So let me quickly add that the technical terminologies for this class, for this week, include absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and opportunity cost. So to reiterate, all things being equal, trade among nations is advantageous to all trading partners because leveraging the comparative advantage of each country enhances the efficiency of global supply chains. This allows countries to grow their economy through the sale of goods and services where it has comparative advantage, while it's still being able to enjoy the goods it imports from trading partner countries with comparative advantage in the imported goods and or services. Because I introduced the phrase comparative advantage, because it is critical to understanding why trade among nations is potentially advantageous to all trading partners. I am then positing that the three phrases for this week are absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and opportunity cost. Now, here's the meaning, right? Beginning with absolute advantage, which refers to the ability of a country or an entity to more efficiently produce a greater quantity of goods or services than the competition. Again, refers to the ability of a country or an entity to more efficiently produce a greater quantity of goods and or services than the competition. This theory of absolute advantage dates back to Adam Smith, an 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher who was a pioneer in the field of political economy. In Smith's seminal economics book, The Wealth of Nations, he theorized that countries should focus on goods they can produce efficiently and should use trade as a way to acquire anything they are not able to make themselves. it is important, let me take a moment to underscore that the ability of a country or an entity to more efficiently produce greater quantities of goods and or services. So if, as an example, all things being equal, so that we get the logic of this, all things being equal, if you can import widget A, whatever widget A may be, it may be a pair of sneakers, it may be a watch. If you could import widget A and be able to sell it in your domestic market for $10. But for a variety of reasons, manufacturing that widget A in your country would cost $20. That means to make a profit in manufacturing that widget A in your country, you would have to sell it at 20 plus 1 to make a profit. And if you wanted to sell it at cost at $20, it will be twice more expensive than if you were to import it. This will suggest that you cannot efficiently produce widget A than your competitors. Part of what may make it expensive to produce widget A may be the value of your currency. So now you see why some countries manipulate their currencies. This is probably a conversation for another class, but realize that there are some advantages in also having manufacturing capacity because it speaks to the level of skills and complexity of skills that is inherent and endemic to your labor force. And that's some of the incentives to want to manufacture in your country. And also the beneficiation of the value chain of manufacturing that goods and service versus merely exporting and then logistics and implementing logistics to distribute and sell that widget. So now we understand what absolute advantage is. What about comparative advantage? Comparative advantage refers to the ability of a country or an entity to produce goods and or services at a lower opportunity cost compared to the competition. So comparative advantage refers to the ability of a country or an entity to produce goods and or services at a lower opportunity cost compared to the competition. But what is opportunity cost? Opportunity cost refers to what you would have given up to buy what you want in terms of other goods or services. When economists use the word cost, we usually mean opportunity cost. So to understand this, here's how you want to understand the opportunity cost at a micro level. So if you have $10 in your wallet and you absolutely intend to spend $10 this Tuesday evening, and it turns out that you have a number of options. You could A, spend $10 to buy dinner. Or you could B, spend $10 to rent a movie. So now you have a choice. Spend $10 on movies or spend $10 on dinner. If you choose to buy dinner, the cost of that dinner is not just the $10 that you paid. It also includes the price of the movie which you could have gotten. So what it cost you to get that dinner was to pay $10 and give up on your desire to watch a movie. That is an opportunity cost. So that is on a micro level. On a macro level, the calculation gets a little bit more complex, but it's still the same basic logic. And here, let me see if I can give it a good go. So consider that we're going to limit the variables. Consider that you have a number of engineers who write code for iPhone. When they write code for the program that runs iPhone, it creates so much employment throughout the value chain, from the people who fabricate the chips that power iPhone to the people who actually put together iPhone to the shippers who ship iPhone from where it is manufactured to international markets, to the retailers who sell iPhone and hire people, to the repair companies that fix iPhone when invariably you crack the glass. This is the multiplier effect of writing the code for the program that runs iPhones. Now, the people who write these programs are mathematicians, as I'm sure you know. So they could also make very good elementary school math teachers because they know math very well. Now, understand that elementary school math teachers are critical, because if you don't have good elementary school math teachers, you're not likely to have great engineers who will then write the next program for the next iteration of smartphones. Even as I acknowledge that, you can see how, from a pure economic point of view, it may be necessary, it may make more sense to have your best mathematicians focusing on the writing code for iPhone rather than teaching high school math. Because if they teach high school math, the cost or price of that teacher teaching high school math is not simply their salary. It's the entire economic value chain that economy has given up because this cohort of engineers are no longer writing code. Remember, as I described that value chain, from the people who fabricate the chips to the companies who cobble together, assemble the phone, to the shippers who ship the phone, to the retail store staff that sells the phone to you, to the repair companies that fix the phone when you invariably break it. So that's the opportunity cost that you're giving up, the economy is giving up, by having these top-rated mathematicians and computer scientists instead teaching high school math. So perhaps the lesson is that it's best that computer scientists work on computer code and math majors teach math. That's just a simple explanation. But to be clear, this is not to say that math teachers in elementary school are not critical to the knowledge base of an economy or a society. They are. Because if you don't have them, you're not likely to have students who graduate into computer science majors later in their life. So the learning outcome for this week, obviously, are that, to reiterate, distinguished and contrast between GATT and WTA, which we have covered. Explain the role of North American Free Trade Agreement, which we have covered. Describe and explain the role of other regional trade agreements, such as the Association of South Asian Nations, ASEAN, which I mentioned. Or, this is a good one, since many in the class have a heritage in the Caribbean countries, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. So these are just variations of USMCA. It creates a common market for Caribbean countries in the case of CARICOM, similar to USMCA for North America. And in the case of ASEAN, it creates a common market for South Asian nations. Describe and apply theories of trade, such as comparative advantage. We have just delved into that. So before I open the floor to questions, I'd like to congratulate the class for being well on our way to successfully completing week 9. So by Saturday, that should wrap up. Week 9, of course, is global trade relations, and it is the second of 3 segments that began in Module 8. So we are making progress, and obviously I am impressed with, and I hope you're also impressed with how the class is layered and built on knowledge, and each week builds on the knowledge of the previous week. It is fun and exciting stuff, and I thank everyone for making time to attend and or watch today's lecture. Again, this is the conclusion of today's lecture for office hours, Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. Economics 3:30, Global Trade, Political Economy, Medgar Evers College, City University of New York. Thank you and good night.